So we're back here now on the Chip Shot Football Podcast to discuss some more about some quarterbacks in the NFL. This time we're going to stop in New York and touch on the situation with Daniel Jones because up until now, the Giants have had a lot of time now to reflect on their season and how it's gone so far. Now that they're in their bye week, they're going to have a lot of time, even more so now, to talk about what are the problems with this team, right? So after a very disappointing loss, to a 2-7 Panthers team that has been the furthest thing from a functional organization, a good developing organization, to lose to them, again 2-7 over there in Germany. Not only did you lose to a bad team, but you had to have that flight all the way back home. Just a terrible experience, I'm sure. And it's safe to say that they've reached as close as to rock bottom as you could imagine, right? I can't imagine it gets much worse than this with this group. And now the Giants, looking at them, they're tied for the worst record in the NFL. Now, currently here on Wednesday, sitting at 2-8 with the Jacksonville Jaguars down there as well at the bottom. Cleveland, Tennessee, and Las Vegas also have 2 wins, but they're ahead of them because they're 2-7. They've only played 9 games where the Giants and the Jaguars have played 10. So those guys are a little bit further down. They could join them if all 3 of those teams lose, obviously, this upcoming week. But, going back to now this week and back on Monday, head coach Brian Daboll had his talk with the media, and he spoke about the bye week and their plans and what they were all going to do, during the bye week, right? But also, he was asked, obviously, about Daniel Jones and continuing as the starting quarterback going forward. That was a question that was asked to him just as the last couple weeks went on after, some disappointing performances, after they've lost, their last few games. That was always one of the questions that they asked Brian Daboll, right? Just to kind of check in, make sure that nothing changed, right? And the same answer that Brian Daboll always gave was that Daniel Jones was the starter. He's our starting quarterback. There's nothing that's changed. He always said Daniel Jones is the starter, right? But this time around, he didn't say, to be fair, he didn't say that Daniel Jones wasn't going to be the starter, but he also wasn't so adamant about saying that Daniel Jones, he is the starting quarterback. He basically didn't say anything. And, last week, the most recent weeks, he said that Daniel Jones was the starter. And I think this week, he just said something like, we're going to evaluate everything, go through the tape and everything like that, and just go through a typical bye week, right? That's pretty much all that he said without me actually including the quote. But again, I know the one thing that he didn't say is that Daniel Jones, yes, is our starter going forward. So there's a little bit of a change of tone there, obviously. Then we had some reports coming from Adam Schefter of ESPN, and he gave his personal thoughts on it, I'm sure, from what he's been hearing and just his personal opinion. He felt like Daniel Jones was going to get benched and that they are probably going to start Drew Lock going forward. That's based on, his thoughts and what he's what he, I'm sure, is hearing, what he analyzes on this situation. That was his personal thoughts as well. And then General Manager Joe Schoen actually talked about the bye week as well yesterday. And if the Daniel Jones' contract, this is exactly what he was asked. One of the questions that was asked to General Manager Joe Schoen was whether or not Daniel Jones' contract would factor into any decision regarding his status as the starting quarterback, which is a great question. And, if you guys weren't familiar with Daniel Jones and his contract and why that question would be asked in this context, is because Daniel Jones signed that 4-year, $160 million deal, right? The one that we talked about, the one that we didn't agree with, right? That one. What we didn't really talk about that one at the time was the fact that there's no guaranteed money on the final 2 years of that deal, and he's currently on the second year of that deal. He signed it right before the 2023 season. That was the first season under it, and 2024, this year, is now the second year on it, obviously. So now after the conclusion of this year, those final 2 years, there's no guaranteed money that the Giants actually owe to Daniel Jones, unless he continues to play this year, right? And say he gets hurt. If he gets hurt, and I'm sure if he misses some time, like a week or two or something like that, then next year's salary now all of a sudden becomes guaranteed because of that injury that he sustained, potentially, hypothetically, the rest of this year. 2025 salary would be guaranteed now instead of not being guaranteed. So that's obviously a huge deal. Without that guaranteed money, it would allow the New York Giants to move on from Daniel Jones and walk away from him being their starting quarterback and take a limited cap hit rather than a much larger one if they owed him guaranteed money. So that's why that question was posed to General Manager Joe Schoen. He obviously has a lot to do with the financial decisions and the contracts and everything like that. So they asked him about it, and based on that and why that question came up, there was some rumors that the Giants were thinking of making, a business decision and benching Daniel Jones, mainly for that reason, right? No player coach would admittedly say it's because of that reason, right? But it is something seriously to consider based on how this season has gone and how they invested in Daniel Jones, obviously over Saquon Barkley, and the Hard Knocks clips about the discussions with Saquon, the owner, John Mara, having a hard time sleeping at night if Saquon left and joined Philadelphia, and everything turned out the worst possible way for the Giants in that regard. So that's why, this point has come up now because, it's gone to a point where it's at a point now with Daniel Jones where, you can't just kind of say, let's just give him more time. Let's give him an opportunity with this offensive line. That excuse has kind of run its course now, and there's really nowhere else to hide or go to other than the fact that maybe they just messed this up. They just screwed this whole situation up, and they shouldn't have given Daniel Jones this contract. But, we're not faulting Daniel Jones. Obviously, if they offer you that contract, no one's not going to take it. So it's really just more so on the Giants in this situation. And obviously, General Manager Joe Schoen had some comments to make about it that I wanted to include on here. When he said yesterday to the media about that question, he said, "We're going to evaluate everything the rest of the week, and the decisions we make will be football decisions. Any decisions we make moving forward as we evaluate the roster and what we're doing for the final 7 games will be football decisions," right? And it's kind of hard to argue with that point, right? It's kind of believable when you look at Daniel Jones' numbers this year, and he has a 63% completion percentage, just barely over 2,000 yards, 8 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, and a 46 QBR, which is 27th in the NFL. And for you to be ranked down there and be making $40 million per year, you got to at least be in the upper quadrant, the upper third, I would imagine, for that contract. And, the Giants, we talked endlessly about the overemphasis, I believe, on the quarterback. And, the market is what the market is. I understand that. But sometimes I feel like teams just don't make that hard decision to move on from a quarterback when they're not really fully committed. And I don't think the Giants were fully in on Daniel Jones. They'll be halfway and they think, all right, he's the quarterback, let's just give him the money. One, because it could get expensive later on, but also because they're too afraid to rip off the bandage and not keep Daniel Jones around for the fear that, it's going to just, demoralize everything around their organization. So it is a hard decision. I'm not going to debate that, but I wasn't too big of a fan of this decision, and now it looks like they're going to bench Daniel Jones, right? I think they will, because whenever, like Joe Schoen said, he says they're going to evaluate everything the rest of the week. The decisions will be football decisions, and as we evaluate the roster and what we're doing for the final 7 games will be football decisions, much like the Chicago Bears and Matt Eberflus said when they asked him about the offense and Shane Waldron and whether or not they could change anything. Matt Eberflus similarly said, we're evaluating everything. So I feel like when anybody says that, it usually ends up with a change, right? They don't want to say it, they don't want to give anything away, but it pretty much just sentences whatever decision that they're going to make as a guarantee, in my opinion. So I feel like they're going to bench him. It's gone to that point. There's nowhere else they could go to now, and they're at the bottom of the NFL now. So it's not like changing it is going to really do too much at this point. And now looking forward just a little bit briefly here before we finish this segment. If you do move on from Daniel Jones, and I believe they will and they should, it becomes a situation where do you tear it all down? Do you completely restart? The owner, John Mara, has already said that Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll are more likely than not going to stay around. So it's not like they're going to have to find new coaches or a general manager. But I don't think they're going to tear it all down because, Dexter Lawrence is having a phenomenal year. They traded for Brian Burns and gave him a huge contract, so they're not going to move him. Kayvon Thibodeau, I think he's a good enough piece to keep around. Maybe you could trade a guy like Azeez Ojulari, or actually, he's going to be a free agent, so he might just move on anyway. Darius Slayton is another one they could lose in free agency, but I don't think you tear it all down because I think the offensive line has been a little bit better. They've been ravaged by injuries somewhat. Tyron Tracy looks like a good player. Obviously, Malik Neighbors is going to be a huge star, I believe, in New York. They just need, that quarterback. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked out. Their decision to bank on Daniel Jones instead of Saquon hasn't worked out at all. So, benching him, whether or not it's for financial reasons, it probably is somewhat. It is what it is now. That is the part of the game and part of the NFL that organizations do have to take into account, and you don't want to do a disservice to some of the players, right, who are on the last year of their deals or still want to play for something, but that is how it goes, unfortunately, when you have a season like this. The organization has to look further than just football and think about the organization, the finances, and things like that. So I believe Daniel Jones is going to get benched. It's just a matter of when they announce it. But yeah, I mean, that's where the situation is with the Giants at this moment. But moving on from those two topics, we're going to get into a couple discussions that I wanted to have with you guys here for the rest of the show. Starting off with two segments here, talking about the biggest flaws that we've noticed so far in each conference for each playoff team so far halfway through the NFL. We're going to start with the NFC, go through all the playoff teams, and list off some of their biggest flaws that I've noticed so far through the NFL. We're going to do the same thing with the AFC in the following segment. So don't go anywhere. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
Looking